Hi, Damien. This is Ira. I'm recording here my voice feedback on your statement of belief. The idea is to give you a sense of some of the things that reading it, some of the questions it raises for me as a reader, in hopes that that may be helpful as you move from this assignment to the assignment we're working on now, which is the Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts essay. So, jump right in. One of the things that I think is really helpful about the way you approach this is you start right off with a definition. First off, you say arguments are exchanges of opposing views, usually with the goal to offer good enough reasons to persuade. And in general, I've got to say, I really enjoyed reading this very thoughtful piece. And you go further in a way that I think is really interesting when you say that arguments are necessary for the production of value. And I'd love to hear more about what you mean by that, how you think that functions, and to see you articulate a little more fully how exactly that cashes out in your way of thinking about good and bad argument that you get into later. I think this is probably a broadly accurate statement, but and it's nice to see you kind of thinking about where arguments come from, why we argue, why they matter to us. And I'd like to see you make the transition here from those reflections to your sense of good argument and bad argument a little more in a little bit more definitive way. So, like, one of the things that's really cool about how you start this essay is you're thinking in a really interesting way about why we argue and what arguments are for. And I'd like to see a little bit more of that infusing a direct articulation of what good argument is. Okay. So, and I think, when you say you cannot argue a fact because it is an indisputable case, but we have today this controversy of what facts are true and who's making them. I certainly think if you want to expand on that and think about that a little bit in more detail with regard to how argument happens in digital contexts, I think that might be, you don't have to, but that might be a particularly appropriate consideration to take up and expand on in your Defining Good Argument paper, in your Fuller paper. So when you say here then a good argument has one single declarative point, and I feel like there's a little bit of slippage here, because on the one hand, you do say that doesn't mean that the argument is only one statement, but it means that the argument is focusing on one point. And so it might be helpful to be a little clearer about the distinction you're implicitly making when you say that, I think, between an argument as the overall overarching procession of smaller arguments. And so each smaller argument has a single declarative point. And the overall argument, does it not? I think it's interesting to think about. Those aren't necessarily the same. The individual small arguments that together comprise that larger argument. The reason I'm focusing on that is because you go on to think about arguments in terms of maps and models in a way that I think is really useful. But it also, we lose a little bit here, I think, of the sense of the overarching story that you start off with at the beginning of the first page, where you're thinking about what arguments are for. So I'd like to have a little bit fuller sense of what arguments are for written into your way of defining good argument in digital contexts. Oh, sorry, building in a roadmap, not a model on a map. Sorry. I thought that was a very clever, thoughtful way of thinking about this. I'd love to hear you say more about that. And specifically say more about why that's good argument. In other words, how does this way of arguing fit with your definition of what argument is for. Likewise, what are some of the ways in which bad argument fails to fit with your overarching sense of why we argue, why we want to argue, what we want from arguments. When you talk about bad argument, it's not necessarily the same thing as a wrong argument. In other words, good arguments are good because they're effective, and bad arguments are bad because they're ineffective. So you say bad argument is all about the way it is argued. It doesn't matter if that argument is wrong, if the information used to support that argument is false, because both of those things can be present in a good argument. I think that's a really important insight. And so then from there, you go on to talk about bad argument as sloppy, i.e. it's something that we can't trace back. So I think here we kind of come back again to this question of the individual arguments, the sub-arguments, what have you, that together comprise some larger argument. There's a little bit of slippage because, so even if we can trace back the points, is a lot of times that won't necessarily be effective in persuading somebody. So what has it been effective in the case of good argument? I get that it's ineffective. Bad argument is ineffective in as much as it's sloppy. It's hard to trace back. It's not well built. The map doesn't lead us clearly back where we got started. And that makes total sense to me. But I'm not as clear on why essentially that matters as a reader. So I'd like to see you. I'd like to see you detail a little bit more again how individual arguments or pieces of argument within an argument, the larger body, relate or ought to relate, and then what that sort of road mappiness or buildingness within an argument has to do with the overarching purpose of that larger argument, if that makes sense. So when you talk then about bad arguments being sometimes a good thing, or of some value, I'd be interested to hear you say more about, again, how that fits with your overarching story about what arguments are for. You do come into a little bit of that at the end, but it's pretty much just describing different kinds of moments, right? We use them here, certainly since before the birth of the United States, right? Since, thousands of years. But when you come out here to say, when do we use arguments, you're coming out and saying that in a way that sets you up to just articulate some different moments. And what I would love to see here in the conclusion of your defining good argument in digital context, I'd love to see you take this thoughtful way of meditating on what arguments are for, and take the way of constructing arguments that you think is good, and first build up the latter a little more fully, explain a little bit more fully how good arguments work. But then also, in explaining more fully how the working of good arguments is related to the aim or value or meaning or purpose of argument in general, use that to help you drive yourself beyond the merely descriptive towards maybe deeper concluding thoughts. And to be clear, I say that not as a criticism of the statement of belief. You did a great job on this. It's really totally interesting to read and engaging and thoughtful. But rather, I'm trying to help you think about how you move from here to the much more substantively, rigorously, theoretically articulated definition, properly so called. And I'm hoping that at the end of that, you'll be thinking about implications of that definition for how we live together, or you'll be thinking about some entailments of that definition that are less descriptive of things that are readily observable, as here, and descriptive maybe more of things that we wouldn't think of, actually, unless we were looking through the lens of your definition of good argument. So, anyways, as you move forward to that next stage, I hope that you'll come see me in office hours or make an appointment to come see me some other time. And I look forward to continuing to read your work and hear from you. All right, thanks.